This week, the Ontario government announced new employment standards for app-based gig economy workers, including a $15 an hour minimum wage. Joining us now to understand what's in that legislation and how it might work in practice, all in the provincial capital, Joshua Mandryk, labor lawyer at Goldblatt Partners, Catherine Marshall, employment lawyer at Levitt Sheik, who also sits on Ontario's Workforce Recovery Advisory Committee, Laura Miller, Head of Policy and Communications at Uber Canada, and Ivan Ostos, Lead Steward at Gig Workers United and a courier for Uber Eats. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hello.
Looking forward to this discussion. Before we get into it, I just wanted to talk about some of the Ford government's proposals. Let's take a closer look. They want to institute a $15 per hour minimum wage for the time gig workers spend actively working. Gig workers being those who do ride-share deliveries and other work assignments through an app. They want to introduce regular pay days. Businesses would not be permitted to withhold tips. Workers would be told how and when tips are collected by the business. They want more transparency for workers around how the company's algorithms calculate pay and how workers are rated and penalized. Workers will be given the right to resolve their work disputes within the province and will be protected from reprisal. Finally, all of this will be separate from the Employment Standard Act. However, the government is now considering including them under the Act. I wanted to get your reaction from all of you of what those proposals are. Catherine, let's start with you. Do the PCs, a party not usually associated with Labour, deserve kudos for those proposals?
I think they definitely do. The government's really taken a pro-worker stance. And the reality is gig work has been around for a really long time. It's not a new thing, and it's been a totally unregulated area of the workforce. And this is the first time in Ontario and also Canada where protections are being brought in to give gig workers some basic employment rights. So the way to look at this is a great beginning. It's not the end, it's the first step. And I think there's probably going to be some exciting changes coming in the future. It's a work in progress.
Ivan and Joshua, I want to get your reaction. Catherine mentioned, these are basic employment rights. Briefly, is this a step in the right direction? Ivan, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think the right direction would be to consider us employees. There's no reason that gig work should not be part of the Employment Standards Act. Like you, Catherine just said, we're talking about work that's been around for a long time. The new aspect of it is the technology, right? The app. But other than that, gig work's been around forever. People have been delivering on their bikes forever. People have been driving people around forever. They did it in horse-drawn buggies. There's nothing new about this work. So these people deserve all the basic employment that all workers in Ontario get. Things like paid maternity leave, paid sick leave, everything you just listed in this list, I don't think anyone thinks is crazy, right? Like everyone deserves this stuff. We would already get this and more if we fell under the Employment Standards Act.
Joshua?
Yeah, I've got to agree with what Ivan's saying here. And I want to clarify a point. This is not an unregulated area. These folks ought to properly fall within the Employment Standards Act. What we're seeing is widespread non-compliance and non-enforcement of the law. So what we really need for these folks is to clarify and shore up their rights under the Employment Standards Act, not treat them separately and differently.
Laura, while you represent one of the biggest gig companies, what did Uber make of the government's proposals?
Well, now sometimes in the rush to be first, you don't get it right. And that's what we have here. So while the Ontario government is the first in Canada to introduce legislation in this space, it falls short of what drivers and delivery people want. And that's benefits and flexibility. And to be frank, it's a bit of a head scratcher. Based on the minister's own expert panel and an agreement that Uber struck with UFCW Canada, there are counter proposals out there that satisfy what it is that drivers and delivery people tell us that they want. In fact, 91% of drivers and delivery people in Ontario support the government implementing the Uber UFCW deal, which would include 120% minimum wage for work time, termination pay, flexible benefits fund, workers' right. So it's a head scratcher for us because the government had an opportunity to give more and they ended up moving ahead with less. I think there is an opportunity for the government to address these issues as it goes through the legislative process, and we're hopeful that they will. In Washington State right now, Republicans and Democrats have actually come together to move forward on a package that was proposed by a union, the Teamsters, and by industry for rideshare drivers. So we think that there is a path, and we look forward to engaging with the government on that.
Laura, you called this a head scratcher. You know, there's no one here on the panel from the government, but I'm thinking they would probably say, you know, Uber is worth $66 billion and nothing stops your company from providing your workers with higher pay, vacation time, and other protections. So why isn't Uber doing that?
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is the fact that we're having a conversation about this new type of work, app-based work, and how we try to squeeze that or fit that into existing labor laws. The reality is that these laws are outdated. They were created for a different time in a different era. So we need reform in order to be able to provide these benefits and protections. You know, trying to fit app-based work into the existing laws takes away from the unique nature of this work. The reason why it's so appealing to so many people is because of the flexibility. This is unlike traditional work where, you know, if I'm a cashier at Loblaws, I'm not necessarily also a cashier at Sobeys or another retailer or grocer. Here, drivers and delivery people are able to use multiple apps. They're able to log on and off as they want, work when and where they want. And this is quite unique. There's no other type of work that gives you that flexibility. And when we talk to drivers and delivery people, 86% of them tell us they could not continue to do this work if it didn't have the flexibility, because for so many of them, they're doing this on top of their careers, their caregiving responsibilities, their parenting, their studies. And so they need that flexibility. So I think it's fair to say that driving and delivery, those services have been around for a really long time. The nature of app-based work is so different. And in terms of how the individuals, the workers interact with the apps, that's different as well. And so, you know, sometimes you can't fit a square peg into a round hole.
Ivan, Laura said the flexibility is very appealing, but do you think, is the perception from government and these app companies that rely on people for labor, that gig work is looked on perhaps as something you do to fill time, a hobby, instead of something that pays the bills and puts food onto the table?
This is real work. This is real risky work that real people do. People come to this country and start doing gig work, and they do it for years on end. I've been doing gig work for 6 years now. This is not like a part-time, you know, a hobby for me. Obviously, I enjoy doing it to a certain extent, but this is real work, and I think all workers deserve real benefits and real employment status if they're doing real work. About flexibility, man, I really don't believe that this flexibility idea is unique to gig work. In fact, I know people in lots of employment jobs that have flexibility, have on-call status, right? The app doesn't make that particularly special. And when we talk about workers wanting flexibility, you know, there is zero in the Employment Standards Act about flexibility. There is nothing that prevents you from being flexible and being an employee. So the narrative that, you know, workers can only choose flexibility or these things is just not true. People want the flexibility. Uber wants the flexibility. And I think the business model that they have requires that there is that flexible model, right? So I don't think there's anything mutually exclusive about that. Also, I'd add that, you know, when Uber asks the workers about what they think, these are surveys that they send out within the app wherein all the answers are to their own liking. You cannot answer the survey without giving something what they want. So 90 plus 1% of workers wanting flexibility. Yeah, of course. That's why people have, they got to work. They have to fill out the survey.
Catherine,
Yeah, I think if I could just
Right, if I
interrupt
could.
for a quick second,
Sure.
because I think it's just really important to say, obviously, of course, Uber does provide surveys directly through the app. The research that we're citing is through an independent company, an accredited polling company. So I think it's important to note that for the record. I think the other thing to say is, obviously, we know, and we see this through our research, through independent studies, that about 12% of people who do this work, they see this as full-time. But for the vast majority, this is something that they want to be able to schedule around their other responsibilities.
Well, you know, when we
I
do
wanna
talk
just
about
jump in if I could.
yes, let me just, I'm coming to you, Joshua, right now. We keep hearing about one of the appeals of doing gig work is the flexibility. Would treating gig workers like traditionally full-fledged employees and including them in Ontario's Employment Standards Act come at the expense of that appealing, flexible nature of the job?
Absolutely not. And so Uber's entire argument rests on this false dichotomy between flexibility and employment status. Workers can still enjoy flexibility while being employees. All it means is they're going to enjoy the basic protections under the Employment Standards Act: minimum wage, overtime, vacation pay, and other crucial protections. When Uber talks about flexibility, what it's really talking about is its own flexibility to have a contingent, on-demand workforce that it can only pay for engaged time, and not give the protections they deserve. That's the flexibility they're talking about.
Catherine, what's your view?
So I have a few thoughts having listened to everybody. I'm on the Workforce Advisory Recovery Committee. I spent all summer hearing from hundreds of stakeholder groups, tons of gig workers, employers, people who are working in this space. And I heard a huge variety of views. I think Ivan's making the mistake that a lot of activist groups make, which is it's all or nothing. And that's not going to help you achieve your goals. Ivan, you should be happy that your advocacy is resulting in these changes being started. I mean, you can't take the position that unless you give us everything we want, we're going to hate it, right? Like, you're never going to achieve anything that way. Uber is involved in a very complex pretzel of PR and spin. Of course, there's nothing stopping Uber from giving their workers whatever they want to give their workers. I mean, they're the company. They can. Lots of companies give workers well beyond the minimum standards in employment law. So really, we have to look at gig work as something that, yes, it's been around for a long time, but technology has made it really evolve and explode in the past few years. It's a work in progress. This is a beginning step, and gig work is unique. It's not the same as regular traditional employment. I really disagree with what Ivan said that people who are in traditional employment relationships have the same level of flexibility. That's not true. I'm an employment lawyer. I only act for workers, by the way. I see hundreds of contracts a month, and if you're in a traditional employment relationship, you don't have that kind of flexibility that a gig worker has. You have all kinds of terms, like you have to be exclusive. Like, you can't, be driving, for example, for like Uber and be switching to the Lyft app, for example. I don't really know of a full-time normal job where you could work like one day a year and still be employed. You can do that with gig work. There's a high level of flexibility. That is something that I heard from a lot of workers this summer that they want to protect and preserve. And what they're looking for is protections, but they don't. There's a reason why they're not in like full-time regular work. Like, they don't want to have a boss. They don't want to have someone telling them where to work, when to work, what they can charge, what hours they keep, when they take vacation. There's a reason why they're not choosing that kind of work, and we have to listen to them and give them the autonomy and not try and speak for them all, because they all have different views on what they want, which is why they've chosen this flexible work arrangement.
And Catherine, you said you don't want to speak for them all. And I should mention, some people might be doing this gig work because it is the only option that they have. I wanted to give Ivan an opportunity to respond to what you said. You said that Ivan is making a mistake. It's all or nothing, and you should be happy with what's on the table. Ivan, if you can, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to Catherine, and also if you can give us a sense of what it's like been working as a gig worker during this pandemic.
Does anyone here think I don't deserve certain rights? Like, I don't deserve vacation pay? Do people think I don't deserve sick leave, during COVID? Do people
You deserve
think
all
that
that.
the Uber driver who can get COVID working 60 hours a week in Pickering, he doesn't deserve those things? That's what I'm talking about. This isn't, when we say all or nothing, I'm talking about basics. I'm talking about the Employment Standards Act as a minimum. This is not crazy out of the ballpark stuff. This is basic stuff. And with a good collective bargaining agreement, democratically voted upon by the majority of the workforce, we can get even more than that. So that's why I don't think this is a crazy far out idea. I think this is actually very minimal in terms of what people in this country deserve. With regards to,
What it's been like working during the pandemic as a gig worker.
People die doing this job. that's not like an exaggeration. People have gotten COVID being Uber drivers, being Uber carriers, doing gig work with Skip the Dishes, Amazon Flex, all this stuff. And what do you think happened to those people? Do you think they were paid to take time off when they got sick? No, they weren't. In fact, because of the nature of this work, people may have been incentivized to go to work because they struggle to pay bills, because Uber controls the rate of pay. That's another thing I actually wanted to flag. Catherine said, I don't have a boss. You think Uber is not my boss. You think they dictate when it is most profitable for me to work, which is always the same time, lunch and dinner. I don't work midnight because there's nothing going on. They dictate how much I am paid. Even the information I get as a courier, I got an order yesterday. It said 2 minutes to pick up, and that's the only information I got. I didn't know how much I was getting paid. I didn't know how many kilometers I was doing. I didn't know where I was going. This is not an independent contractor. This is a boss telling me what to do via an app. That's it.
Well, Laura, I want to give you an opportunity to respond. Ivan also said that because of the nature, he said people were dying Ubering, and because of the nature of this work, people were incentivized to actually get on the road and drive even if they were sick. What's your response?
I think one of the things that we did see throughout the pandemic is the role that app-based work played in helping people through it. We saw in the early days of the pandemic, as people were losing their jobs, as employment numbers were skyrocketing, as people were seeing reduced hours in their workplace, the number of signups on the Uber Eats delivery platform tracked that exactly. So, and we know that a number of drivers and delivery people told us they didn't qualify for government programs, they had lost their job, they had reduced hours, they needed a way to cover the bills. And so the ability to download an app and get on relatively easily made a huge difference to them and their families. So I do think that, the role that app-based work plays in the flexibility, in the fact that it does allow, it connects, riders with drivers, delivery people with customers and restaurants, certainly did help a number of families. And we know that to be true. I think the other thing I just want to, focus on is we talk a lot about, there is no difference in terms of why wouldn't Uber just do these things. The reality is that there's a test when it comes to labor classification, and in order to provide the flexibility inherent to the model, we have to adhere to the independent contractor model. So to say, well, you can just offer these benefits that employees receive, first of all, we can't do that because that's not the relationship we have with drivers and delivery people. I just quickly want to highlight that in Geneva, a few years ago now, they moved, that government moved so that couriers had to be employees. And what we saw is 77% of people lost their work. And now the rest of them are assigned to shifts. They're quite unhappy, and they're paid out monthly instead of instantly, and they're told when to be available. So I think, that the real life example of what happens when we see that happening in Geneva, we see what the impact was. 77% of people no longer having access to flexible earning opportunities. We don't think that that's the right way forward.
Josh and Catherine, I want to ask you this question. Do you think that gig workers are precarious workers who are often exploited? Joshua, I'll start with you.
Absolutely. I mean, that's not really a question that can be in dispute. I think listening to Laura's comments there's a bit of a mix-up between desperation and precarity on the parts of these workers with freedom and entrepreneurship, I think. I have no doubt these are precarious employees. And as Ivan said, there is extensive control exercised over them. In terms of the employment tests that are applied, there's a recent employment standards decision just from last week applying such tests and finding that an Uber Eats courier is an employee. I think that that's the correct determination.
That was one person, though, right?
That was one person, and there's other determinations in the works. There's a certified class action, but unfortunately, we're seeing workers having to fight tooth and nail themselves for those determinations. We should be seeing leadership from this government clarifying and shoring up their status as employees.
Catherine?
Look, Ivan and Joshua are advocating for their position, and part of the way they're trying to advocate for it is by really framing gig workers as this really exploited class of workers. I've talked to many gig workers as part of my work with the panel. I can tell you that for most people, this is work that they choose to do because they enjoy doing it and they want to do it. And I do agree that some of these workers have vulnerabilities that the like skilled workers might not have, and that's one of the reasons why the government has brought in some of these protections to just level the playing field. But this notion that people are doing gig work because they have absolutely no other choice and they're being forced into it and they're all exploited, like, it's just not true. It's a spin.
I don't think anybody said they're being forced to do the work.
Well, that's certainly the impression I think that Ivan's giving. And I mean, I have a question for Ivan. Do you work for more than one gig app at once, or do you only like work for one app?
I do whatever is most profitable for me.
Why does that matter, Catherine?
That I have to do multiple apps in order to make a living. But that is all because I would much rather work one app. I would much rather just work for Uber and make a decent living just doing Uber. I think it's ridiculous that some people have to multi-app to do their job. Isn't that ridiculous? Like working at Starbucks and Second Cup at the same time, filling out orders. That would be crazy. But we do this in this industry because we have to. It's not really a choice.
You like switch between the apps and like see who has better rates at the same time. Like you would never get to do that in traditional employment, right? Like,
I'm saying I wouldn't want to do that. Who wants to do that? It's ridiculous.
Lots of people do because you can make more money that way, right?
Yeah.
If you're
I would rather make more money from a single app. Everyone would do that.
I think that's
Let me ask this question to Laura then. Laura, how many Uber drivers make their living solely off of driving or delivering for Uber, just using your app?
So we know from our research that there's about 12% of drivers and delivery people who do this work, and we know that the vast majority of them are on multiple apps for the reason Ivan says. They want to be able to be in control of how much they are earning. I think the other conversation around this is the fact that, as an employee, you can earn a minimum wage. Here we're talking about like an earning standard for engaged time, because the reality is looking at drivers in the GTA in the fall, they were making on average $31 an hour. And so I think it's really important to know this as well. When you talk to drivers and delivery people, one of the primary reasons why they like this as well is because they are able to optimize for earnings. They are able to move between apps and see who's busier, what's a more interesting area, and what incentives might be available. And so, that's part of the reason why this is, again, a unique characteristic of this work that you wouldn't see in a normal employee-employer model.
Well, I want to bring this back. I want to bring it back. Just 1 second. I want to bring it back to why we're having this discussion, because you mentioned that people do this work to optimize their earning. And one of the reasons why the government says they want to bring in this $15 minimum wage is because sometimes one week you can make X amount of dollars, and then the next week you make half of that. So they want more transparency around that. This question is for Catherine. The legislation stipulates that gig workers will be paid a minimum wage during active work, aka when they're actually transporting food or people, for example, rather than the time in between when they're waiting for an assignment. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. One of the issues that will happen is if, and I know that certain people are advocating that the minimum wage should not apply just to active time; it should apply to the entire time that someone is on the app or available to be on the app. Once you start getting into the territory of a guaranteed draw or like a guaranteed salary, you get into the area of exclusivity and the idea that, okay, if Uber, for example, is paying someone a guaranteed base wage for all the time that they spend driving around, they're going to want that exclusivity. They're not going to want that person jumping around between the apps. And then we start kind of veering into the area of like, well, then this is just really no different than like standard employment, which again, we keep coming back to that core debate. It isn't the same. Gig work is different. It's unique. It's flexible. It's innovative. And I actually think it's unfortunate that like Uber is occupying so much of the debate in this space, because most gig work is not rideshare platforms. Like this summer when I did the consultations, like we heard from tons of companies and people who are working in the gig economy. You got skilled trade people who are going on apps and they're picking up jobs, like this sort of on call, on demand work that's being facilitated by these apps and connecting the service provider straight to a client. It's not just like the rideshare world, right? But this is unfortunately an area that's occupying all of the debate and the focus.
Joshua?
A few points. First of all, workers go on multiple apps because these apps only pay them for engaged time. It's what they have to do because they have no security in that regard for their earnings. This is not a $15 minimum wage. It's a $15 minimum wage for engaged time, for when they're actually fulfilling orders. It's like if you had a cashier and you only paid them for when they had a customer at the till. It wouldn't be acceptable in any other situation, and it's not acceptable in this one. In terms of the challenges that this may pose, this could easily be addressed through regulations under the Employment Standards Act. If someone were to multi-app, you could determine when they should be paid by the first app and when they should be paid by the second. These are issues that could also be addressed by the companies if they chose to, for instance, require that someone work exclusively during that time. But if you were a worker and you were actually guaranteed minimum earnings, you wouldn't have to hop between apps to try and ensure payment. This is framed as if these are, entrepreneurs looking for the most profitable ride. These are workers that need work and don't get earnings unless they're doing a ride. So they have to go on these multiple apps. Otherwise, they're sitting there idling, getting $0. It's not fair.
Joshua, I wanted to follow up with you. When these new gig rules do come into effect, do we know how they're going to be enforced?
It looks like it will primarily be a complaints-based system. The broader problem is really this is a floor that is below what these workers already should be having under the ESA, and it's probably below what these apps are already paying. $15 minimum wage for engaged time is going to work out to maybe $7.50 an hour, maybe $10 an hour. It depends how busy it is. It's even less than Uber itself was advocating for. So this is really meaningless in terms of the earnings that these workers are going to have. But it is going to be largely complaints based, based on how this looks. And if it's anything like how the Employment Standards Act has been enforced, we know that the government is not going to be proactive in protecting these workers.
Laura, Catherine said that Uber is kind of taking up space around this conversation. And I think, Catherine, I know which app you're talking about. There's an app called TaskRabbit. If you need someone to do something, you can just go and get someone. Anyway, would you say that the Ontario government fully understands how your platform functions?
I would say I really don't think so, and the reason for that is just because it is quite complex. And for apps like Uber and Uber Eats, it's obviously there are workers who are engaged, but there's also customers, people who need rides, people who need deliveries, and also restaurants and merchants. And so when you start to talk about this space, it can be quite complicated. When we started our discussions with UFCW, we spent 2 months just walking them through in great detail and answering their questions about the app and the marketplace. Because it is quite complex. And I think when we talk about that example of, if a cashier, we pay her for the hour, it doesn't matter if she's checking people out or not. That is true, but that cashier can also be asked to mop a floor or help stock shelves. That cashier can't decide that they want to go across the street to the other grocery store. That cashier can't decide that they're just going to stop working and start their studying. So again, this work it's completely different. To Catherine's point, it's innovative. And so I think what we do sometimes is we try to kind of take that square peg and fit it into the round hole instead of saying, okay, what is this work? How does it actually work for workers, for consumers? And then what are the right set of regulations around that? I think we're quite concerned with some of the regulations included because, we think that it puts at risk, worker safety, rider safety. And so it's really important to us as we get into these conversations with the civil service and with political officials to have them understand the app, and we're willing to take the time and walk them through it.
Ivan, you've said that you depend on Uber to make a livelihood. A couple of years ago, gig food delivery company Foodora left Canada after the Labour Relations Board said its couriers could unionize. Do you worry that if this market faces further government rules, that Uber might leave and then you might be out of work?
My worry that after Foodora did that, they were forced to pay workers across Canada who were not even involved in the union upwards of $4 million to all the workers across Canada as a settlement during a pandemic. That never would have happened if we had not struggled like we had struggled, right? So I'm not concerned because I know that when workers have real democratic power, and when I say democratic power, I'm not talking about like a backroom deal wherein Uber consults some large union and does not get any democratic worker input. I'm talking about workers who are organized, mobilized, ready to take action. That's when we make real gains. So, you know, if Uber's threatening changing a model, talking about this thing in Geneva, saying that, oh, well, if we do this, then, you know, you're going to be a shift, you're going to do that. They're talking about a scenario when workers have no input. We want input. We want democratic input in how this business is conducted. And I think when workers have that, it's going to be a lot better off for us. It's going to mean that we're going to have a living wage. We're going to be covered for our expenses. The price of gas right now, you think it's easy being an Uber driver, getting $3, $4 for a delivery when the cost of gas is so high? I don't think so. Also, bringing up the 31 or so dollars, I can't remember what exactly you said, that workers doing Uber make in Toronto. That's great. I would love to see that in a contract. If it's that easy to pay workers that much, I don't see what the big deal is. Talking about 18 or 15, let's get 31 for everyone. Let's get 31 plus vacation pay. Let's get 31 plus all-time engaged. I don't see why that's a problem.
Catherine, I'd like you to respond to that question as well. If this market faces further government rules, is there any concern that it might leave?
I mean, the spin that Ivan's giving that somehow Fedora leaving the country was a good thing for gig workers is a bit absurd. I mean, ultimately, having work available for people is a good thing, right? Let me just finish. Having work available for people is a good thing. We want to be balancing, or the government needs to be balancing innovation, supporting the gig economy, encouraging investors and companies to operate while also protecting workers. And it is a balance, Ivan. It's not a black or white situation. It's not everything or nothing. Governments, when they're setting policy, have to think about all the stakeholders and make the best decisions. And I mean, if, like I said, like I applaud you, Ivan, because honestly, your advocacy is probably one of the things that resulted in the government taking this really big step. And like, you should feel good about that. Like, I really respect you, and I think that you're doing really good work. And this is how, you know, these legislation is not built in a day, like it's an incremental thing. It takes time. The government has definitely kept the door open for continuing to do this. I mean, Uber's spin doesn't make any sense to me. They're trying to say that the only way they can give their workers all these things is if they're declared independent contractors in law. I mean, that's not true at all. I have contractors coming to my office all the time, and I see that their employers are giving them all kinds of things. I mean, there's nothing stopping Uber from doing that if they wanted to. So this is really just a beginning, but it's got to be a balance. It does, because how is, you know, scaring away all these companies, Ivan, going to be good for workers? They're not going to have jobs.
I'll give you the last 30 seconds, Ivan, to respond.
Yeah, I think if Uber wants to leave the massive market that is Canada, well, there's Skip, there's DoorDash, and that's why we're organizing the entire gig economy. Like they said, workers do multiple apps. So it's a pretty low risk for us when we know that there's multiple apps out there for us, and we're ready to take the stand to enforce our rights for our democratic input in this business model. The balance that you're talking about has been in the employer's favor this entire time. So we are finally now moving a little closer to workers having say. And we're already talking about me having too much control when I get $3 for a delivery and I have to accept it because there's no other option out there. I think that's a bit crazy.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all so much for your insights. We really do appreciate it. It was a very passionate and very civilized debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.